10 years ago, Leicester City began their campaign that would be forever etched in the history books, not only Leicester City's history, but also the Premier League history. Leicester City, while in the year prior was the first year back in Premier League, going through an incredible relegation fight to end up having one of the greatest survival stories that we've had in recent years, to then go through that experience with what was mainly the same squad in main areas and go on to win the Premier League, going on to lift the FA Cup, competing in all three European competitions, to a quarter-final of the Champions League, to the semi-final of the Conference League. That Leicester City side had unity, work ethic, leadership, desire, near perfect recruitment, and a never say die mentality. A spirit that flew between the football club and connected the community to the club. Now, they had none of that. Leicester City in the 2024-25 campaign goes down as, of course, probably one of the worst Leicester sides in their history in terms of performance in the league. And as miserable as seasons can get, it was pretty low. The only reason why it feels like it wasn't as low was because Ipswich Town and Southampton was all the same, just as bad. Southampton, of course, being the worst. But there was many different parts of what made this year even more miserable. For example, Leicester City, for 9 straight home games, didn't even score a single goal. All those games, of course, being losses. So comment down below your thoughts on Leicester City, their sort of fall from grace from the mid-2010s, and how do you think they can build for the championship this year? Now, of course, that Ruud van Nistelrooy is now sacked. Like, subscribe, and Merzel Designs for the best football prints, all made by myself. Use code Vizeh for 15% off all items. Now, maybe a lot of this could have been seen beforehand, of course, being promoted with Enzo Maresca, who of course went to Chelsea. Bringing in Steve Cooper, which at the time, I guess from the outside, could be seen as somewhat of a sensible piece of recruitment, that he's a manager with some recent Premier League experience, with a team that's been through this before, promotion and trying to fight to stay up in the Premier League, and he didn't last long at all. Then bringing in Ruud van Nistelrooy, that of course had a bit of pedigree to him, winning the Dutch Cup with PSV Eindhoven in the Netherlands, and had of course 2 games or so for Manchester United. His name probably did a lot of the pull than anything else, but he did win something in Netherlands, so he has got something there. So is he worth a risk? They took the risk on Ruud, and it completely backfired. As of 5 days ago, he's officially parted ways with Leicester City, going into their next championship campaign, which of course they'd be looking like they'd be going on to have another promotion, as that is seemingly how it typically works. No matter how bad of a situation your club seems to be, going from the Premier League to Championship seems like it's night and day. Similar to how when Sheffield United last year conceded over 100 Premier League goals and were looking like they were one of the worst sides ever, a complete disaster. They go down to the Championship and they're one of the best teams again. Same thing with Burnley and, well, Luton. The least said about them, the better. Many fans have gone against the Leicester City board, including planes and, of course, banners in the stands. One of them being King Power Clueless sack the board. Another banner displaying similar sentiments as well at full time. This was towards the director of football John Rudkin, who is a figure which many people see as the main culprit for their failure. Of course, next up would be the ownership. Now, King Power, the Thai group, has been synonymous with Leicester City since their success for over a decade now. We have to keep in mind here that this is in a different way to what it used to be, as now the ownership is Ayawat, who is the son of the original owner Vizeh, which I'm pretty sure we are already aware with the tragic helicopter crash outside of King Power many years ago, where not only Vizeh but 4 others lost their lives. Now, what happens with almost pretty much all tragic events is that there is a true sense of unity, where everyone puts aside their differences, and you may not even be a Leicester City fan, but it felt like everyone was behind Leicester City. Even before when they won the Premier League, Leicester City became a symbol to many people in England, where your club can become one of the best teams in the entire country with good recruitment, a strong culture, and an ownership that cares about not only the club but its people. And Leicester City to many people were a underdog that everyone loved, not only in England but also across the entire world. Leicester City was that symbol where it is possible to win the Premier League and to make whatever dreams you have come true in this sport. Being in other top 4 races, the most obvious being basically in the top 4 for the entire campaign, being miles ahead at some points, and near the end collapsing and falling out to the top 4 both times, right to the final hurdle. That really damaged Leicester City more than you can ever imagine. Now, the unity did make an impact in other cases, of course being the FA Cup win back in 2021. The scenes that day and the emotions between the players and the staff and everyone involved with the club was truly great to see. And with this season, there has been some strange little storylines here that makes it feel like it's just not a nice place to be, as there's some players that are having some serious problems with not just the club but also Ruud van Nistelrooy. The most obvious one is of course the likes of Harry Winks, that has had a lot of falling outs. It appears at one point in April he was discarded from the Leicester City team because he refused to stay overnight at a training ground hotel between training sessions. This is because his partner was having a newborn baby that week. He wanted to travel back each training session to be at home with his partner at this time period, which makes complete sense, and for this he was discarded from the club. Another example could be Yannick Vestergaard, who also commutes back and forth from London, which seems to be a common theme, that commuting seems to be a big problem with Ruud van Nistelrooy himself. Because of this, he's been in the cold for nearly the entire year. So what else actually went wrong here? Well, having Maresca at the start of it and staying there for as long as he did was a problem. Of course, all recruitment, they were already planning recruitment for the squad way before they even got promoted, because they were so far ahead in terms of a title race. They were already planning for the Premier League back in January, February time, like most football clubs should. And this was of course with Maresca in mind. And of course, with it starting with Maresca, all players were identified for a possession-based style of football, which was how the squad was formed in the Championship. When they knew Maresca would go, and they wanted to bring in the likes of a Graham Potter, however, he didn't want to come. Due to the pressure of waiting before the next season starts, they had to make a move faster than what they really should. So despite them really wanting Potter, which would feel like it would suit much more what they want, they decided to go for a also somewhat decent candidate, however may not suit the football that they were intending on playing and the players they were looking at recruiting, and of course Steve Cooper. And he was back to a decent level. £80 million was spent with Steve Cooper in charge in that summer, and 12 games into the season he was already gone. At the time this seemed somewhat harsh, however many of the fans were already making their discontent very well known with Steve Cooper. Of course, Nottingham Forest and Leicester City have somewhat of a rivalry as well, which of course didn't help matters. The sacking did seem harsh at the time, with 9 points in their first 8 games and were only 2 points outside the relegation zone. But it wasn't only the fans, it was also the players too. The main one was of course with this infamous Christmas party in Copenhagen, where there was this clear disconnect where many players in Copenhagen, and there was a sign of one of the players holding up saying, "I miss you, Enzo." Now, if Cooper could have kept Leicester up is entirely, hypothetical, and likely is he probably wouldn't. But it is a fair comment to say that could he have done any worse than Ruud van Nistelrooy? And the idea is, for me, he probably would have done a better job. In terms of the transfer recruitment, there was some transfers that I thought was pretty good. The likes of Facundo Buonanotte on loan from Brighton I thought was really good for them. And also Bilal El-Khanous was also a good piece of business from Genk. And I think he's actually a proper good player. They did bring us some players to bring some much needed experience. Jordan Ayew and Bobby De Cordova-Reid could also be seen as fine pieces of business, but of course would bring us some decent wages. The midfield had a bit of a problem though. There were players there that still was there, which they already wanted out. They already started off with Harry Winks and of course Hamza Choudhury. They already spent £20 million on Oliver Skipp. On top of that, £5 million on the Chelsea midfielder Michael Golding, that didn't play a single minute of first team football that entire season. However, the transfer dealings can be brought down to one move, which showcases how poor it really was. And that is the striker Odsonne Edouard from Crystal Palace. This was a loan and took up the last possible loan slot, also paying quite a large amount of wages. He wasn't played at all for either Cooper or Van Nistelrooy, and this later down the line hindered what they could do in January, as they couldn't send him back, so they had to keep him on, otherwise they would pay a large fine. This means that the only piece of business they did in January was £2 million for Wario Koulibaly, who was a right back. who only made 5 appearances. But Ruud van Nistelrooy has reasons to believe that he has been sort of dream here. He was promised that he would have support in January, and was a familiar claim made by Brendan Rodgers in his final season as well. This has been a running theme where managers at Leicester have been promised to be backed in the market, and when it comes to it, they simply haven't. The main reason for this has been always due to PSR. Similar to Southampton and to a somewhat extent Ipswich Town, I think Ipswich had a bit more less apathetic aspect to it because it was their first year in the Premier League. Both Leicester and Southampton had this apathetic feeling where they just didn't care. That there wasn't anger anymore. It was just numb. A feeling numb. Even for me personally, I know a friend of mine who's a Leicester City fan where I think from February onwards, he just didn't watch a single game or highlight, or he would barely even check the results. He would check the result maybe at the end of the day. He wouldn't even bother watching the game. Because if you're losing 16 games out of 18 and not scoring a single goal at home for 9 games in a row, yeah, I'll probably do the same. So what happens then with Leicester? Well, the Nets manager needs to oversee a complete squad rebuild. This could very likely be restricted with financial pressures with PSR. Alongside that, they need to start well next season. Otherwise, with the fans that are already pretty disconnected from the club, it could turn quite sour pretty fast. In terms of the next manager of Leicester, if we're looking at the odds of who's the most likely, right now is Danny Rowe at Sheffield Wednesday, Sean Dyche, and Chris Wilder. Sean Dyche does live in the Midlands. He lives, I believe he's always been around Nottingham actually. So I can imagine him going to Leicester. I just don't know if that would work in terms of the identity club. But I wouldn't be surprised. So comment down below your thoughts, like, subscribe, and I'll see you next time. See ya.